guys, it's Kathleen, and today I'm going to be talking about all the podcasts I listen to. Apologies for this not being a bookish video. I promise there will be another one of those on Tuesdays, but I talk about podcasts a lot on my channel in various favorites videos and things like that I've made, so I figured it was finally time I made a video talking about all the ones I listen to most. If you have never listened to a podcast, I have some that are really good to start with. What I love most about podcasts is that there's one for everybody's interests. If you like Harry Potter, there's a million Harry Potter podcasts out there. If you like Twilight, there's a million Twilight podcasts out there. If you're interested in current events, there's current event podcasts, there's musical theater podcasts, there's literary podcasts for anything you could possibly want. And over time, I have a few that I've collected that are some of my favorites, so I'm going to talk about those today. The first podcast I want to talk about today is the first one I ever listened to, which is Dear Hank and John, hosted by, of course, John and Hank Green. If you don't know about Hank and John Green, you don't know about Vlogbrothers, they're essentially two brothers who run essentially a YouTube empire together. They now have a company called Complexly that runs a bunch of different shows on YouTube, and then they have this podcast called Dear Hank and John. The premise of it, for the most part, is that people write in, ask them questions, they give bad advice, and bring you all the week's news from Mars and AFC Wimbledon. It is one of the most lighthearted podcasts, even though some of the questions can get serious at times. It's definitely one of those laugh in public and look like a weirdo kind of shows. I think what I love most about it is the camaraderie between Hank and John. Obviously, you get that occasionally in their videos when they do reunion videos and things like that, but you definitely feel it more on this podcast. You get a sense of how close they are, and you get a sense of their family history, and you get to know them more as people, which I love. So I absolutely love this podcast. The second one I want to mention is one I want to talk about if you are just getting into podcasts, and that is Serial. So everybody has listened to Serial by now. It's the most downloaded podcast of all time, but if you've not listened to it or you're just getting into podcasts, this is such a great one. It's from the makers of This American Life, which is, I believe, a radio or TV show in the US that deals with current events. I don't know much about it myself, but it's an investigative journalism podcast following the story of Adnan Syed, who was imprisoned years ago for killing his ex-girlfriend. Basically, the podcast is trying to figure out whether he really did do it, whether this was a wrongful conviction, and then ultimately to determine whether he should still be convicted based on the evidence they uncovered throughout the podcast. It is incredibly addictive. It definitely really launched the binge listen concept, and it's also the podcast that really brought podcasts into the mainstream and made them this big popular thing. It's incredibly smooth production, incorporates music really well, and really does offer a really good balanced look at the events. I think it's an incredibly solid piece of journalism, and I love it, and it is one of my favorite podcasts. Also worth noting that that one had significant impact. Like, I believe Adnan Syed has gotten a new trial. His old conviction was thrown out, and he's officially going to be tried again, regardless of whether this will actually go to trial. So that was a big deal, and that's something the podcast did, so that was really cool. In that same vein, although not quite as highly recommended, I do want to talk about S-Town, which is also from the producers of Serial and This American Life. S-Town follows the life of this man named John B. McLemore, who calls the producers of This American Life and tells them about this murder that happened in his hometown in Alabama that he believes was covered up, and he believes that there's this big conspiracy going on with the police. They go down to investigate this murder, but find out it most likely didn't happen, but then another death occurs, and then the podcast starts following the life of John B. McLemore and who he is as a person. The reason I say not as highly recommended is because this was one of the first long-form podcasts I listened to in this way, and I loved it when I first listened to it. I thought it was phenomenal, and I do think it's an amazing story. It's really well done. It's heartbreaking at all the right times. It's poetic, much more poetic than Serial ever was, and it's really beautiful, but at the same time, I didn't realize this until someone else pointed this out to me, but it's questionable whether this has the same amount of journalistic merit as Serial does. And by that, I mean, is the podcast worth it? This is an in-depth invasion into these people's lives. Some of them look really bad as a result of this, and the question is there any public good to this podcast, or is it just a really well done piece of art? If it's claiming to be journalism, which it is, shouldn't it be held to those same standards? And maybe not, and that's something we have to look at too, but in my opinion, it should be. So although I still love the podcast, I think it's great, I do recommend it, I definitely do see more of the issues with it now from a journalistic perspective. But yes, it is one of the better produced podcasts out there, and it is a good one that is good to get into because it's only 7 episodes, so you can finish it pretty quickly, and it's a very interesting investigative podcast. Since most of you are booktubers as well, or you people who enjoy watching booktube, I assume if you're watching this channel, you might want to hear about some book podcasts that are out there. So my absolute favorite book podcast of all time is called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. I've talked about this a couple times on my channel. I've got a couple people to listen to it, which makes me so happy. But Harry Potter and the Sacred Text examines each chapter of Harry Potter, all 7 books, as if it were a sacred text. And by sacred text, yes, we're talking about the Bible, we're talking about the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, like sacred texts that are important to people. Every episode they read each chapter through a theme and discuss the theme, and then they engage with the text using a different sacred practice, and then they take a voicemail from a listener, and then they bless somebody from the chapter at the end of it. Oftentimes they have guests and they incorporate different religious and spiritual perspectives into the podcast. If you're thinking it sounds overly religious, I can promise you it's not. Even though I'm not hugely into the spiritual but not religious movement, I think that's an accurate way to describe this podcast. It really is all about gleaning meaning from the text, figuring out how Harry Potter can teach us lessons in our own lives in the same way that sacred texts do. I think this has something to offer for everybody. It's part of why I love it so much. I've seen people who are complete atheists or who are not religious at all anyway who really love it. There's people like me who are religious who really love it. I think it is great for everybody regardless of your religious beliefs. And something I think they do so well is incorporating different beliefs into it. It's hosted by two people who even have slightly different spiritual beliefs and come from different spiritual backgrounds as well. There's a lot of diversity in it, and they really do incorporate their own beliefs and theology into it, as well as opening it up for other perspectives too. I really like theology, and I really love like sacred texts and studying them and stuff like that. So I'm a big nerd for it, partially because they do things like Lectio Divina. They do this amazing practice called Florilegia, and I won't spoil you what it is, but it's so cool, and I love it so much. And it's really given me this amazing appreciation for Harry Potter that I guess I always had, but it's given me such a deeper one, and I'm really grateful for that. The second book podcast I want to talk about is in a series of Unfortunate Events podcasts called Unfortunate Associates. Unfortunate Associates is hosted by Tyler and B. I don't think their last names are on the internet or anything, so I can't really share that information. But it is, as you guessed, in a series of Unfortunate Events podcast, and it definitely chronicles different things. So they first did an in-depth look at the books, then they watched the movie, and now they do reviews of each episode of the TV show. I know Daniel Handler was involved in a lot of controversy towards the beginning of the year, so he definitely has some issues, but I can promise you this is just a really good podcast, regardless of how you feel about him as an author now. I still kind of love those books. I can't lie about that, and I think this podcast is really good, and it reminds me a lot of why I love the book. It's also really funny. Tyler and B are really funny and just have a really good comedic timing together. It feels like you're really just listening to two friends hanging out talking about a series of unfortunate events, and I cannot think of a better time. So I really love that podcast. I highly recommend checking it out. I feel like it's a bit underrated and I want more people to know about it. And the final podcast I will be sharing with you guys today is a new one by the New York Times, and that is The Caliphate. This is another good one if you like investigative journalism podcasts. I think this is a good one to get into. It only has about 12 episodes so far, so you won't be super far behind, but it follows a reporter who is investigating ISIS. The Caliphate, if you don't know, is essentially what ISIS imagines as the dream sort of utopia for everybody Muslim in the world. Sharia law will be enforced, everybody will be Muslim, non-Muslims will not be allowed to go there, and it's basically what ISIS envisions for the world. This is an excellent podcast for so many reasons. I'm really enjoying it. It looks at so many different aspects of ISIS that I had no clue about. It interviews people who were former members, it interviews people who have been abused by ISIS, and it's really such an amazing piece of investigative journalism. To me, this kind of reporting shows how fearless reporters can be and how far they can go for stories, and I absolutely love that. It's well done, it's interesting, you do feel like you're learning a lot about current events at the same time, so I think it's phenomenal. I highly recommend checking it out if you want to get into a journalism podcast. This is a great one, and it's ongoing, it explores so many different issues, and it's just a really great production all around. There are definitely more podcasts I want to get into. I really want to give Welcome to Night Vale a try. Let me know what your favorite podcasts are if you listen to podcasts or any that you want to get into, or if you do listen to any of these, then please let's talk about them in the comments below. I will be back with a bookish video on Tuesday. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe on your way out if you're new here. I upload videos mostly on Tuesdays and Fridays, but guaranteed twice a week. If you would like to follow me on any of my social medias, I will link them all in the description, but in the meantime, I'll see you guys next time.